like and subscribe. Forensics and people involved with managing the deceased. What's the weirdest cause of death you have come across? Had a sad one where a guy tried to hang himself from the 3rd floor balcony. The rope broke, and he fell, and impaled himself on fence spikes. A lady walking her dog hours later thought he was a gruesome Halloween decoration, until she noticed leakage from the poor guy. Security camera footage from across the street showed he was alive for a while, before he bled out. Paramedic here. I once worked in a seaside community where there was a bad winter storm. Due to its location, it was quite bad compared to most places. I'm talking -30 added point C, 100 plus km/h winds, extreme amount of ice in the ocean and lots of snow. This day I was doing the dispatch and also responding to calls. I get a phone call that there was someone found frozen on the front step. We rush down there and find a 50-ish-year-old lady sitting on her front step by her door completely frozen solid. She lived in the last house on a road that was right next to the ocean. I remember how windy and cold it was. In healthcare, there is a saying that you aren't dead until you're warm and dead. But this lady was clearly frozen solid. It was hard to examine her on the step due to the high wind and snow. I remember her key was in the deadbolt. It was open, but the door wouldn't budge. I had to use all of my weight to get it to open, and when it did, a bunch of ice fell from the edges of the door. I pick her up to move her in, and her body doesn't flex at all. Holding her up, she was in the exact same position as she was on the step. Her daughter showed up at this point and explained that she was at the neighbor's the night before for dinner and left around 8 p.m. We got the call for her around 7:30 am the next morning. While examining her, I found a bottle of nitro clenched in her fist. Her daughter mentioned she had angina and used it a lot. I was assuming she couldn't get the door open and started having chest pain and sat down. We were told the autopsy results, and it was confirmed she died of a heart attack. I worked as a medical examiner transporter a few years ago, and I saw lots of crazy stuff. One of the calls I went on was definitely strange. While the cause of death was suicide by hanging, the context of the scene was bizarre. He was a younger guy, maybe in his mid to late 20s, and he had been living in an older couple's shed in their backyard. They claimed not to have known him, but had allowed him to live there. Inside was evidence of some pretty severe mental problems. The guy had scribbled all over the inner walls of the shed with what seemed like anything he could find: pencils, charcoal, permanent markers, crayons, etc. He had hanged himself directly in the middle of the shed, and all around him were little messages and things. One said something along the lines of, "Fear outside," and another said something like, "Fear'll be here soon." The most bizarre message that my partner could not make heads or tails of was written right above his little cot in the back. It stood out because it was written in some of the largest font, and it just said, "Why the is Greg here?" I had been on calls for suicides and the like before, and many of them had been significantly worse, but this one really stood out to me. The cause of death was not super weird, but the entire scene was. Not a forensics person, but a girl that went to my primary school went to warm her car up in the winter, and after starting it slipped on some ice and knocked herself out. She landed adjacent to the tailpipe. The end expired due to carbon monoxide poisoning. Radiation sickness in an amateur scientist that had been performing ill-advised experiments. Tests had to be conducted to determine if the cadaver itself was even safe to handle. It's not something I expect to see again, but then, I said the same thing the first time I saw someone who got crushed under a tractor, but that is evidently just more common than I expected. I sometimes have to receive bodies late at night that the police bring in. The weirdest one I have had was a guy who was living in his ex-wife's garage without her knowledge. She never went in there, except for when a scrap metal merchant knocked on her door asking if she had anything for him. She suggested they try the garage, where they discovered a rank smell and a decomposing corpse wrapped in blankets. She was initially a suspect, but it turns out that he had been suffering from cancer and had died of cancer while strapped in the sheets. We also had a little girl a couple of weeks ago who swallowed a battery from a remote control and died when the acid burned through her stomach and caused internal bleeding. Edit, I'll add another one. This guy was alive when he came in, though died later. He came into hospital with no legs below the knee and the top of his head missing. Turned out he was on his way home, drunk from the pub, and fell asleep on some train tracks whilst taking a shortcut. The train cut off his legs, then spun him around, and cut off the top of his head. He died whilst in hospital, but he lived for a bit, which is amazing. The paramedics brought his legs into hospital in a plastic bucket. My future child accidentally swallowing battery is my new fear I have never thought of before. Thank you for sharing this. I will tape up all things will battery when I become a dad. I am a paramedic. One of the ones that sticks out in my mind. Get called by a man to do a wellness check in his sister. He lived on the lower floor of a house. Her the upper. He was wheelchair bound, and she was his caretaker. She had not come downstairs that morning, and he was worried because he heard a thud that night. Didn't think anything of it until she did not show up at the AM. So we go up the stairs. I see little drops of blood on the stairs. More on the whole floor. We follow them. Find the bathroom. Blood everywhere. Blood all in the bathtub. Toilet is full of blood. Huge clots on the floor. Bloody handprints all over. Blood in the sink. We go looking for her. Find her on the floor, between the bed and the wall, telephone next to her. Clearly, she was trying to call for help. She was white as a ghost. Usually, a dead person will be blue or purple and mottled. She did not even have enough blood left for that. I am guessing it was ruptured esophageal varices, but it was never confirmed. We checked for blood in her mouth and her butt, but there was not much. She had no trauma. We did not find any booze, but I never know. One of my university professors was involved in a case where an otherwise healthy 40-year-old female had died. Let's say instantaneously. I'll explain. Woman was like a CrossFit marathon type, went out boating with her husband, boat capsized pretty far off the shore of the Atlantic, and they both ended up holding on to emergency floaters drifting in the ocean, no life jackets, for a few hours. Now, it wasn't the winter obviously, but for whatever reason/season the water was pretty cold, so hypothermia was a concern. Coast Guard sent a helicopter to pick them up. I don't know why they didn't send a boat, and they strapped the husband up and bring him into the chopper. He's fine. They put the woman on the board, and in the time it takes to get her pulled up into the chopper she dies, when moments before she had been completely lucid and in great spirits. They'd only been out there for a couple hours, so it wasn't dehydration or starvation or really anything they could think of. Woman was in great shape and they suspected the hypothermia hadn't progressed enough to be lethal. Basically, as my prof explained it, since her entire lower half, from the chest down, was submerged in the cool water, it would have cooled down, not just the tissue, but the blood in most of her body, especially since some would have started pooling in her legs after a few hours. This would have been fine if she remained vertical, but when rescuers put her horizontal, the chilled blood fast-tracked into her heart, causing cardiac arrest. He said it's odd that it happened to this specific lady, but that it was a significant death, whereas it's happened before, but they've been able to save the person. So apparently he said they keep you sitting up now until they're able to warm your legs back up to reduce the chances of this happening. Not in forensics, but in healthcare. Watched a dissection early in my training for an older individual that had died somewhat unexpectedly. Once they made the initial opening into the body, it was pretty clear what the cause of death was. Spontaneous rupture of an abdominal aortic aneurysm. The person essentially bled out into their abdomen, so it was basically a massive pool or semi-coagulated blood. Generally understood to be a pretty quick death. So there's that, I guess. A teaching case, death by bull. A woman was found dead in a pasture, trampled by a bull. Well, if you underestimate cattle, that can happen. But she was the farmer's wife, so she knew the animal was aggressive, and everyone else in the village knew that too. The neighbors also said he was never kept in that pasture, because you couldn't see all of it at once. Yep, the farmer murdered his wife with a bull as the weapon. Put him in the pasture without her knowing, then sent her out there for some errand. So I'm a forensic toxicologist. I usually don't work with dead bodies directly, crime scenes excepting, but I do test blood/urine/etc. for alcohol and other drugs. When we get the blood of someone who is dead, the case file will often list a brief cause of death. I have a few favorites. The man who got *BERY* drunk somehow managed to get his four-wheeler onto his roof, and then proceeded to launch himself off. Darwin took over after that. The person who died while asleep after a small airplane crashed into their bedroom. This one isn't mine, but a professor I had once received a blood sample from a blind stick. No, but that was pretty much pure booze from a ruptured stomach. Not testing that. Not my case but a colleague's. Trigger warning: violent and sexual violence story. Viewer discretion is advised. There was a case where neighbors called about screams on one house. It wasn't rural, but the house had a pretty good space between them, so the screams were pretty loud to make it to the other houses. When you are a criminal investigator, the most horrible case are those where children are victim, but here was no way to prepare for this one. When the police got the call, it was dealt like a domestic disturbance case, 2 officers sent. When they got there and knocked, they didn't get any answer, but they heard screams and pleas of help from a woman. They called for backup and decided that they had reasonable cause to force an entry. I consider that the 2 officers did a great job in not waiting for reinforcement and breaching the front door with a 12 gap. They immediately searched for the screaming woman. They found her on a second-floor bedroom tied by the neck to a wall lamp with a chain. The woman was naked, severely bruised, bleeding from different wounds in her body, mostly superficial, crying and screaming like a devil. When the officers entered the room, the woman was being pinned to the floor by a man, presumably her husband or consented partner. The semi-naked man had his left hand in the woman's neck, and he was apparently forcing his right hand into the woman's genital area. Normal police procedure: the officer with the shotgun enters the rooms and calls the suspect to stop. The suspect looks impressed at the officers and tries to reach for the pistol. The officer shoots, killing the man on the spot. In regular circumstances I would joke about how the blood on wall looked like a modern art painting, but the aftermath of this crime was as grim as it gets. The woman was raped and beaten in various ways. Everything was kinda ordinary until the officers see a naked little girl in blood pool on the floor at the other side of the room. The policeman, who took a life less than a minute ago, went oh no, and left the scene entirely. The second policeman was shocked but tried to compose himself to tend to the woman. Reinforcement got to the scene, and usually the mood in a crime scene is serious and kinda of down. But this one felt more like a funeral with 2 officers leaving. My friend was in head of the forensic unit at the time and he supervised the recovery of evidence personally. The autopsy of the little girl was as horrible as the fact. She was raped, sodomized with a broomstick to the point of tearing her intestines, whipped with a belt and the broomstick. Her cervix was also perforated during the torture and there were various fractures mostly in the ribs and cranium. The investigation concluded that the man, husband and stepfather of the child, tortured the child in front of her mother to punish the mother. I don't remember the reason and sincerely I don't care. I do see how anything would excuse these type of acts. The girl was 10 years old. At the end we know that the woman has been in a mental health institution for more than a decade. My friend left the force and had to took therapy for a year, and speaking of the case still triggers PTSD. He now works as a PI with an investigation team, so we can choose on what we are going to work on. But nothing will change that an innocent child lost his life in a barbaric manner to the rage of man. First responder. I've been to multiple suicides, where the person had to shoot themselves more than once in the head. One guy was still alive for about 15 minutes after we got there, but there was no saving him. I'm not a professional, but this is a story that quite honestly I'm still recovering from. My senior year, I had a friend named Brad. I'd prefer not to use his real name. Brad and I shared a math class together. He was a really interesting guy. Very smart. I taught him how to solve a Rubik's Cube one day during lessons, for example. Kind, handsome, determined. My sophomore year, I had attempted suicide via throwing myself off of a bridge 65 feet onto train tracks. I should not walk today, let alone be alive. I am, and I can. Near the end of the year, Brad had clearly become stressed. No time to talk in class, no time for lunch, very irritable. I had found out his girlfriend had broken up with him, and having recently gone through a similar event, I was sympathetic. So I kept pushing to talk with him. We have exactly 5 school days left until grades are finalized, and we are technically free adults. That Monday, we discover we share some common interests, but we also share inverse lacks of knowledge and experience. He grew up with a wealthy outdoorsy family, and I in a lower class working family. We hung out after school Tuesday, he showed me some fly tying, and some stuff about reloading ammo. Wednesday, I took him to this mountain spot overlooking town, and smoked some weed, and talked about getting out of our state. He asked me about my suicide attempt, and why I thought I survived. I told him I had no clue, but I said, if I had been spinning, I'd have died. So spinning would kill ya. He laughed, I laughed, we changed subjects. Thursday, he told me about how strict his parents were. Had mentioned it jokingly, and in passing before, but never spoken at length about the subject. His father was a doctor, his mother had a master's in something or other. If he graduated with less than a 4.0 cumulative GPA, his college trust was gone, and he had 3 months to move out. He explains that he'd head around too much with me during out classes all year. Math teacher was single-handedly dropping his cumulative to a 3.87xx. He was horribly upset. I did my best to help him finish his missing/late work. Easy A. Brad had passed every test all year 100% plus, with an 80% grade weight on tests. He was golden. Friday, I see Brad walk into school. I see his truck. Al's good in the world. But he doesn't show up to math after lunch. I assumed he just skipped. First and last time ever type thing. Good for him, I thought. By end of day, his parents are at the school and it's a manhunt. Brad's missing. I went to the spot on the mountain after school. Found the truck halfway up the trail. Knew what happened, but didn't believe. Went to where we smoked. Saw him at the bottom of the mountain, about a 130-foot fall down a steep sandstone wall. Halfway down, the wall starts turning red. By the bottom, it looks like someone had turned a hose on. Autopsy said blunt force trauma didn't kill him. He asphyxiated. His ribcage shattered, punctured his diaphragm. He had lost something like 30% of the skin on his right side, his arms, legs, chest. Broken arms, ribs, leg. He had jumped around noon. He left at lunch, at 11, and jumped about an hour later after a 20-minute walk from where he left his truck. He died around 2. He stayed down there, shattered and burning and in pain. For 2 hours. And I genuinely blame myself sometimes. TL/DR. Friend committed suicide by jumping off a mountain. Lost most of his skin skidding down said mountain and suffering multiple fractures, and his diaphragm was punctured, and wasn't able to let him breathe. Stayed alive for 2 hours post-jump to best guesses. We had a family friend who was an alcoholic who blacked out, and died of asphyxiation. Official cause of death was unconsciousness forced victim into a position incompatible with LIFO. When clarification was sought they said she passed out, and fell into a position that prevented her from breathing. I did not know that was possible. Remember the kid who was trapped by the folding seat? https://www.cnn.com/2018/04/us/a-high-18-ping-mini-vent-rnd/index. HTML. He eventually suffocated, despite him being able to call 911 for assistance more than once, but officers could not find him. He might have been better off calling family, perhaps they could have gotten there sooner, and actually found him. I'm sorry for this, and I expected to get buried, but in high school I took a human physiology course my senior year, and as a field trip we went along with the forensics class to observe a cadaver. The cadaver we saw was of an 80-year-old male. The cause of death was not given for privacy reasons, but my guess would be some kind of strange organ failure. The man's lungs were speckled a bit as he had been a smoker, but most of his liver was missing, and part of a kidney looked as if it had just lost all its mass. His stomach was oddly wrinkled and warty like a toad, and he appeared to have several broken ribs that were healing. I still wonder if the man died of old age or something weirder. I work in forensics from an engineering and product design aspect. A man was using a large handheld wet saw, imagine an oversized circular saw, to cut a 3-foot diameter concrete sewer pipe that was suspended using 2 sawhorses. When he finished the cut, the pipe fell and pinched the saw blade between the 2 pieces, causing the saw to flip around quickly and sever off his own head. A person was eaten alive through maggots growing through his amputated leg. Not quite what the question is asking, but I've worked for a 911 center. A little while back officers got called to check the well-being of a woman who hadn't been to work in 3 days. They arrive, find an overweight female down on the ground, discolored and without a pulse, surrounded by squalid living conditions and a pet cat wandering her apartment. Officers call in asking for an ambulance to their location. No need for lights and siren. I put in the call to fire dispatch, and they let me know by policy we have to go lights and siren anyway. I advise the officers, and continue with my other work. About 15 minutes later fire dispatch yells over to me. Apparently the woman had a diabetic episode, and had a heart rate of 20 BPM, when the ambulance arrived, which is why officers didn't find the pulse when they checked. IMS took her to the hospital right away and she survived. I can only hope she wasn't conscious much of the 3 days she spent sitting in her own filth. Or the half hour that police officers wandered around her, before calling for medical assistance. Oof. Security called to do a welfare check on an elderly resident at a retirement community. Person did not answer the door, so they made entry, and found the person stuck between the couch and chair in their living room. Moved the chair, and moved the person to the floor. Obviously deceased, but had this odd yellowish foam around the mouth. After looking further, discovered a plastic bag that was wedged behind the couch, with the same foam on it. Person fell and got wedged between 2 pieces of furniture, but face landed on or near a plastic bag, so basically suffocated. I have a book by Australian coroner, i.e. medical examiner, Derek Hand, which covers many famous and well-known cases. But there were some incidental weird ones in there as well, such as a man found with his hands and feet bound in the river. Suicide? Execution-style murder? Nope, apparently he was a one-eyed Houdini who wanted to practice escaping. He wasn't a very good Houdini. Multiple deaths due to a fire that broke out at a hostel for people suffering alcoholism-related brain damage. Nobody ever found out what/who caused the fire, since the patients were also fuddled mentally that most of them could barely even remember the fire. A man who committed suicide by purchasing a giant bottle of insecticide, walking out of the shop, and drinking it in one go. A woman who suddenly collapsed with abdominal pains and died. Turns out she'd had an ectopic pregnancy that had ruptured one of her internal organs. A sex club owner who double-crossed or upset some organized crime figures. They tortured and killed him on the shop's BDSM equipment. Not me, but my best friend works in forensics, and is a pretty good one here in my country. Since we live in a violent place, he has done around 800 crime scenes so far, which means more than 800 bodies in total he has dealt with. 2 cases come to my mind. 1. 4 people hanging out, drunk as a couple and their 2 friends. The couple went to their room and locked the door. The single guy wanted to make out with the single girl, but she didn't want to, so she entered another room and locked the door too. The guy, drunk and feeling amazing, tried to go from the balcony to the window of the girl's room. Of course it didn't work out, and he fell to his death. They were so drunk that even with the cops arriving there, the 3 remaining people didn't realize what happened. They were kinda celebrating and laughing a lot. 2. My friend gets to the crime scene and the situation is headless person on the floor and the head a few steps away from the body. On the walls of the house there were several pages of the Bible and other religious stuff, covering almost all the walls. By the splash of the blood on the walls he sees that the person was on its knees while being killed, but didn't try to react/escape or something like that. My friend finds it odd, then proceeds to check the crime scene with more attention, including washing the head, and see if it matched with the body. So he confirms that first thought, person was alive, on its knees, didn't do anything to avoid it, while the head was being severed. A few days later the sister of the headless guy goes to the police to confess the murder. So here it is what happened. The siblings were both extremely religious and the brother came from the church one day and asked the sister to kill him because he had this vision that God/Jesus told him to die so this way he could go straight to heaven. He then gets on his knees and gives the knife to the sister and she did the deed. Bonus 1. My friend goes to the crime scene. Lady with her 2 hands tied behind her back and a plastic bag covering her face. Cause of death: suicide. Yes, it was suicide. Her husband is not in jail today thanks to the forensics. Never dealt with them directly, but worked at a tissue bank that would recover donor tissue from donors after death. The most disturbing one for me was someone completing suicide while sleepwalking. Not a person who deals directly with the dead, but as a genealogist, I look at a lot of death certificates, so I sometimes come across unusual and surprising causes of death. A rather well-known one is George Spencer Millett, who died in 1909. His headstone literally says, "Lost life by stab, in falling on ink eraser, evading 6 young women trying to give him birthday kisses in office Metropolitan Life Building." https://www.atlasobscura.com/articles/morbid mondaykiss2 death. https://www.atlasobscura.com/articles/morbid mondaykiss2 death. I've personally uncovered many more, but it's hard to top that one. Someone in my family is a medical examiner, and they told me about a case they got called to where a dementia patient choked on some marshmallows. Obviously dementia patients are not supposed to have these kinds of foods, since they constitute a choking hazard, but the old lady saw a nurse eating a bag of them. So she sneaked up behind and snatched the marshmallows from the nurse. She started racing away in her wheelchair with one hand on the wheel, shoving marshmallows into her mouth with the other. Of course it was all too much, and she started to choke as she was booking it down the hall, and it was too late by the time they caught up to her. The poor old lady chubby bunnied herself to death. Not in forensics, but in healthcare. Saw a guy that got so high he decided to go into the freezer and start eating a bunch of frozen raw chicken. Ended up dying choking on it. Not a forensic person, but a friend of mine went drinking at a bar. He's got drunk and the bartender rightfully took his motorcycle keys away. He lived just a few blocks away. When the bar closed, he stumbled toward home, fell in a ditch, and drowned in the inch of water that was in that ditch from the rain that came down. I'm not a paramedic or forensic specialist, but in my early 20s I was a crime scene cleaner. It was mostly self-harm, and we only dealt with the aftermath of the ordeal. Still saw lots of crazy stuff though. One of the most memorable was a death in the greater Phoenix area. We were called in to clean out a home of what I remember to be a natural death. We walked into the kitchen and saw a rather large high chair, but didn't really think anything of it. Made our way to the bedroom and found a full-on man-sized crib and changing table. We destroyed all of it at the family's request, so that none of it ends up on eBay. He seemed to be loved by the community with candles lit in driveway and chalk drawings of "We will miss you baby man." This is all a little off topic, but it was an interesting experience to say the least. Heard this story from my ex-forensics teacher. A middle high school couple was out motorcycling without helmets. While going maximum speed in a residential area, they hit something and were launched across 2 houses. I'm an autopsy doctor, and early in my training one of the cases was a young person found dead at an airport gate. Yup, drugs stuffed up there, but that must have ruptured. Apparently it's not uncommon. It's one of the things to look for in unexpected travel deaths. Paramedic here. Had a few. Homeless guy climbs into a recycling clothes bin to retrieve warm jackets in the winter, and it had one of those barrel type drawers. He got stuck by his head on the way out and was strangled. Weirdest thing was walking up to him across his supermarket car park, and he was just looking up at the sky, but with a frost covered face. Also had somebody die in front of a warm electric fire, and wasn't found for 2 days. The guy was cooked like a roast chicken. Funeral intern here. I have been organizing old death certificates. Recently, I came across a case of a woman who set herself on fire. A few years later, her son was decapitated by a train. Police here. My colleague had a case where an older man fell into the cesspool of his home. He was found with just his feet sticking out. He had opened the lid to check something and had fainted from the smell. He suffocated in his own. Rectal trauma by leaf blower. Obligatory, not involved with forensics or anything, but I have a story my mom told me, and she was told this by her driving instructor and a colleague who both apparently witnessed it firsthand. While the colleague was taking driving lesson with the instructor, a motorcycle driver passed her and the truck before her. While passing the truck, the motorcycle driver's head suddenly flew off of his body. The truck had some very thin steel plates loaded. One of them wasn't properly secured and stood out at the side of the truck, and because it was so thin neither the colleague and instructor nor the motorcycle driver could see the plate. Sorry if my English is weird. It's not my native language, and I'm not sure if all words are correct. I worked for a funeral home as a pre-need advisor, so I would meet with the families after a loss and help them pre-arrange if they chose to do so. One of the strangest deaths I encountered was that a man was on his tractor. I lived in a rural area, and he had somehow gotten his clothing stuck in it, and he was choked to death. Another really devastating loss was of high school siblings that were drag racing down a street. They were in the same car, and the older brother who was driving ran them into a semi and their whole car was torn in half top down. I went to school with their parents. Needless to say, that one was a tough week. Oh, and I met with the mother of a girl that worked in a factory producing Italian foods. My stepdad worked there, and she had actually covered his shift for him. The area was super warm, and they think she passed out and fell into the pasta extruder. Needless to say, the mother was suing the company. They filed bankruptcy and my stepdad quit the very next day. My friend is a pathologist, couldn't work out why a 40-year-old male had died. Finally dissected the trachea and found he'd inhaled an entire frankfurter. Was alone in house at the time of death. I have a friend who is a sheriff/coroner, and he had to rescue to a 17-year-old who was listening to music on over-the-head headphones that was walking on a train track. Needless to say, he did not hear the train. Don't know how he didn't feel it. He was hit by the bar the train conductors used to climb up it. He had a one-strap backpack that almost completely severed his head. They also found his bloody headphones on the rail post to climb up. 1. A work colleague told my ex-husband and I years ago. But a bunch of teens were hooning around in a car, in a sports field, or a large open park. On the paved parts of road, there was also quite a long curved wall, probably used for bull practice or something. As they were driving around, at high speeds, thinking they were made from Teflon, one of the girls decided to sit on the windowsill, and was leaning out at various times. They discovered driving as close to the rounded wall as they could was extra exciting and dangerous. So they kept doing this, and the girl decided to sit on the windowsill/ledge again. Unknowingly, the driver got too close, and her head was being scraped against the wall, and she had no room to be able to move away. It was a gruesome scene to behold apparently. My great-great-grandmother died after being cut nearly in half by a lumber saw in the 1930s. She was wearing a scarf or something when she took her son, my great-grandfather, some lunch and her scarf became caught on the saw and pulled her down. They turned off the saw quickly enough, and she lived for a while afterwards. A while here meaning hours or days, I can't recall, but less than a week. My understanding is she walked to the car that drove her to the hospital, but there was obviously nothing they could do for her. You've been visited by the ghost of a very important man. Pay your respects by liking and subscribing, and he'll grant you 3 weeks of good luck.